Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Fiction. How many of you are visiting us for the first time this evening? Well, welcome. We are the only literary nonprofit that focuses on the creation and enjoyment of fiction. And we're so happy you're here, and please learn more about us because it's a really cool space. There's a whole other floor that you can use if you're a member. So there's some flyers and brochures around, so check it out, especially if you live in Brooklyn. Let's see. My name is Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here. And I also want to let you know that our annual First Novel Fete, which is like the biggest literary party of the year, is happening on December 2nd, and tickets are available for those. So check it out. A couple of housekeeping announcements. We will have an audience Q&A tonight, and if you have a question, please raise your hand, and one of our fabulous interns will bring a microphone to you. That's so that the people who are watching us on the live stream can also hear your question. And if you're joining us via YouTube, welcome to you as well. You can type your questions in at any point during the conversation. We have books for sale in the bookstore. If you have a wristband, that gives you a $10 voucher toward the purchase of the books. They are pre-signed, but you're welcome to stick around and get them personalized after the event. Okay, let me introduce our guests. Oh, I want to say a special shout out to the worker-owned publisher of Zeyn's book, Radix Media, and their partnership in this event. That's pretty awesome, right? Yay, small presses. All right, so Zein El-Amine is a Lebanese-born poet and writer. He has an MFA in poetry from the University of Maryland. His poems have appeared in many places, including Greylit, Split This Rock, and DC Poets Against the War, an anthology. His latest poetry manuscript, A Travel Guide for the Exiled, was recently shortlisted for the Bergman Prize, which is judged by Louise Gluck. His short stories have appeared in many journals as well. He resides and teaches in Washington, D.C., and of course, we're here to celebrate his first collection tonight. Joining him is Hala Alyan, the author of the novel Salt Houses, winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and the Arab American Book Award, and a finalist for the Chautauqua Prize. Her latest novel, The Arsonist City, was published in March last year and was a finalist for the 2022 Aspen Words Literary Prize. She is also the author of 4 award-winning collections of poetry, most recently The 29th Year. Her work has been published by The New Yorker and other magazines, and she lives in Brooklyn, where she works as a clinical psychologist. And our moderator for this evening is Zeyn Joukhadar, the author of the novels The 30 Names of Night, which won a Lambda Literary Award and Stonewall Book Award, and The Map of Salt and Stars, which won the Middle East Book Award and was a Goodreads Choice Awards and Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize finalist. Also, we did a fantastic Zoom event for that, which you can find on our website. His work has appeared in Salon, the Paris Review, and elsewhere, and is included in anthologies such as Kink, This Arab is Queer, and others, and has twice been nominated for the Pushcart Prize. Please welcome them all to the stage.
Thank you. Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm super excited to celebrate both of these books. Thank you to the Center for Fiction for having us. I'm just going to pull out my questions. Okay, so, oh my gosh, where to begin? So first of all, these books are both they're very different books because there's a novel and a short story, obviously, but they're also so similar in so many ways. And I have a ton of questions, but I think the way I wanted to start was just to ask where the sort of either where the concept or the idea came from, or when the moment was when you sort of knew that you had something that would become these books, right? Whether that's the idea for the novel or this the sense that these were stories that were going to end up in this collection together.
Okay. So for me, first of all, hi. Thank you all for coming out. I'm very excited to be here with both of you. So for me, it always sounds so hokey, but it's true. I'm gonna tell the truth. I had a dream about a woman that was sort of like half my grandmother, half not. I'm not going to go into the details of my dream. That's not what we're here for. But basically, I had a dream and I sort of like dreamt a plot out of like an alternative life for my grandmother. Woke up, wrote everything that I could remember down, and then just sort of held on to it for a while. And when I finished Salt Houses and it was sold and I finished the edits, I was sort of thinking about what the next project would be. And I was working on a short story collection of expats in Beirut. And then it just wasn't clicking, it wasn't quite working, and I kept coming back to this woman. And I remember having a conversation with my brother where I was like trying to see if there was a way to get her in there and combine her, and then I was like, what if she's a matriarch? And I still remember like the exact moment when I was like, wait, I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna have one of the children be kind of an expat, and I'm gonna have her be the matriarch, and it sort of fell into place. So for me, it was like the seed of a character that like, this like sort of parallel life that was unlived that just kind of haunted me for like a year before I came back to it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the stories that I wrote, there are 7 stories, and I had written them at different times, and I had all these drafts of different levels, like some of them had 2 drafts or 3 drafts, etc. And 2 years ago, I got a residency in Blue Mountain Center in upstate New York in the Adirondacks. And it was such an amazing place to be because they fed me and they exercised me.
Always good.
They gave me farm-to-table stuff. I was well-nourished. All I had to do was write, that I had no excuse. So I polished those 7 stories, and then immediately, when I came back weeks later, I submitted it to Radix because I saw that the kind of people that were publishing, and much to my that's the only place I submitted them.
Really?
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
And next thing I know, it was Thanksgiving. I was returning from New Mexico, and I was in one of these mobile lounges that take you at Dulles Airport in D.C. from these huge dinosaur-looking things. And I was in a mobile lounge. I didn't know anybody in a mobile lounge, but I get the email from Mayor. Where's Mayor? From Mayor back there, saying that I've been selected for the Megaphone Prize, and I wanted to shout, but I didn't know. I didn't have anybody. I wanted. So that's how the whole thing came about. Some of them, 2 of them were already published, right? Yeah. But the other ones had to be worked.
Okay, yeah, of course. I mean, you know, what's so interesting for me is that, I mean, obviously, you know, the 2 books are of very different sizes. They balance each other out, though. One for your handbag.
I'm so sorry.
No. We love a good book. We really do. But you know what's so interesting is that from what I'm hearing you both say a little bit is, and I think some of this is maybe inherent in a short story collection, that you have, you know, stories that can be very different from each other, that can really run the gamut of maybe even styles and topics. I mean, there's even a haunted house story in here, right?
Right.
And you have to sort of find the through line that ties them together. But also with the novel, I mean, I hear you saying really that there were a number of moments maybe where you were trying to find a way to tie the threads together. And so I'm interested in, you know, what you felt that through line ended up being, or if there was more than one sort of thread that told you, okay, I see now.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you mentioned this sort of grandmother figure.
Yes, I think the matriarch, I mean, I think you're hitting on something for sure, which is I do write novels as though they're short story collections, and then I sort of, like in terms of how I conceptualize them, because I often, so far, I mean, I've written 2, there are multiple characters, and they're speaking from different points in time, so it's actually less daunting for me to think of it almost like short stories or little vignettes, and then you kind of weave it together later. So for me, I think it was Mizna. Yeah, it was like the matriarch was the through line. And then it became kind of this like secondary theme of like secrets and what we keep from the people closest to us and what we keep from our families and how we kind of need them to survive and how they can into like an anchor. It was always her, even when I was writing other like characters. Yeah.
Yeah, she's so much the heart of the story, really.
She is, yeah. I mean, she's like the thing that haunts it and the thing that keeps it together in a lot of ways. But like I couldn't. I mean, even when I was writing about her children as adults, like it was still. They were, I mean, in many ways, all of them are still contending with the choices that she made, like decades and decades earlier. Yeah.
Did you want to talk about that, how that was for you in the collection?
The thread, in terms of the thread. There was, I wrote, there were actually 10 stories, and 3 of the stories didn't fit. Like, there was one story that was written in a kind of the voice of a racist Southerner, and my partner can tell you that she didn't like me during that time. So I had to drop some stories, and then, but I didn't realize what the thread was till actually after it was announced, and I said, "Oh, what is going to be published here?" So I looked, and I realized that there, of course, it's completely interwoven, and there's a lot about consumption, not consumption in a good way and a bad way, in a sense whether there are characters that are being consumed by life, and there are characters that are consuming it, and there's a range of countries that it goes through: Lebanon, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the southern shores of Maryland, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, with all of these characters, I mean, one of the threads that for me kept coming up as I was reading was just that you do see, as exactly as you said, you see this sort of like lasting imprint of the decisions that some of these characters have made, and how it continues to maybe haunt or continue to like imprint upon the present as these characters move through time. I mean, even in some of your stories, there are stories where the story itself, in the span of one story, you actually move through decades of life. And the effect of in that time, the effect of war or of trauma, as well as the decisions they make because of the things that they are facing, right. and that includes both those who stay and those who go, right?
Right.
And I'm interested on how it was for you both to go about exploring those really intergenerational themes. On the individual struggles of the characters, but also how they affect all of the people around them.
Right.
I mean, I love to think of the only things I've written so far in terms of prose have dealt with intergenerational stuff. And there's a novel that I was working on and I put to the side, and I'll come back to it at some point, hopefully, inshallah. But it's basically it's more like in one lifetime, like one character written in first person, and I hate it because I'm like, what is this? This is so boring. And I like, what's happening with like the aunt? What's happening with what? And I feel my attention span being pulled out of it and wanting to tell all these other stories. So it may just be that's, I guess you write what grabs your attention, But I do think there is an element too of like, I don't know, I think of things in terms of the collective, and I practice like I do clinical psych, so I'm a therapist, so I can't imagine seeing an individual client without thinking about the genogram, without thinking about the family tree, without thinking about how they got to this moment, not just in their own life, but like generationally. So I think that it may just be that it's like sort of naturally it's what I'm interested in, likely because it impacted my life, my family's life so much. I also think it's fun to think about how a choice that's made a couple of generations before you, whether it's a choice that an individual made or it's a choice that like a colonizer made for a country, how that can play out even thousands of miles away, even if you've never been on that soil, even if, you know what I mean, like you're acclimated to another place. Like it's kind of, there's something enjoyable about it for me to think about, like how the different ways that we manifest those sort of losses, even if we're not the ones that directly live them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in terms of intergenerational connection, one of the things I realized also after I realized that it's going to be published, that each story represents a pivotal point in my life at a different age, right? So all the pivotal points in my life are represented there. So there's elementary school, in the Birds of Ashrafi, it's a 12-year-old, there's college in Groom, it's a college kid, and then migrating to the United States and changing careers. I used to be a civil engineer, and in 2007 I switched and got an MFA, and and changed careers, and so there was the Killdeer, the story Killdeer, represents that period, So that's how it does represent different stages of life, really, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, both of these books span such an incredible, not just amount of time or geography, but just of like the places that you take your characters from the beginning of a story or the beginning of the collection or the beginning of the novel to the end, that you really feel you get the sense that you really see these characters struggling with themselves and growing and changing in a way that feels really expansive, even in the span of a short story, which is so hard to do. And I'm wondering if you might like to read to us something from the collection.
Sure, yeah. So this is from the title story, which, by the way, Mayor, I always mix it up. Who is it going to be published by? Except, huh? The title story? Yeah, the title story. Lit Hub? Electric Literature on November 17th? Something like that. Electric Literature. So two of those stories are going to be published separately. One by Lit Hub, the Sharifi versus the Party of God. That's what the T-shirt is based on. Thanks to Henry Mills back there, right there. So we have merch today.
Pretty rad T-shirt. You should check it out.
By the way, that portrait is based on my aunt's. That's my aunt there on the T-shirt. But is this how you eat a watermelon? That's what I'm going to read from. Just a few pages. Is this how you eat a watermelon? Is about a guy by the name of Ghassan that's basically eating and drinking himself to death in Beirut, which is a stand-in for Beirut itself. That a city that ate and drank itself to, and in terms of like the hyper-capitalism that exists in Beirut, it was inevitable to arrive at that. And this is one of those stories where you write it over a long time and you keep changing the ending because of what's happening.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've experienced that, Hala. And so the ending was a more positive one before, and then with the multiple disasters that befell Beirut, Ghassan became more fitting character, and the ending became, it didn't end well for him. Not that his intentions from the beginning were good. So is this how you eat a watermelon? The kidney was secured and the doctors were ready to operate on Ghassan the following morning. Not one, not two, but 3 doctors stand at the foot of his bed. Ghassan is tired and nauseous, but the sight of them amuses him. When they begin to talk, he narrows his eyes and melds the triplets into one body. The fact that their speech was rehearsed and sequenced for maximum effect, as if coordinated by one body and communicated by 3 heads, helps enhance the illusion. The doctors are channeling his older brother Kamal, the Minister of Labor. He can see Kamal sitting in their office, knee over knee, his bodyguard stoic beside him, giving the 3-headed Hydra stern instructions on how to approach Ghassan. You have to handle him like an adolescent. He's in his 40s, but he's a child, he might have said. Each doctor has dealt with Ghassan at one point or another in the past few years because of his various health crises: kidney failure, liver problems, diabetes, and high blood pressure. So they knew how to deal with him, but they would have been obliged to sit and listen and pretend to take notes out of fear of the minister. Ghassan loves his food, his drink, and his family, or shall we say families. His first wife was a Lebanese woman, Saad, a childhood friend who was always amused by Ghassan's carpe diem attitude that infuriated his family. She saw this as innocence, not immaturity nor recklessness, and adored him for it. She gave him 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. Ghassan was in his element when he was with his children. It allowed him to roll on the carpet, play in the mud, be a ravenous eater, and liberate his inner Tasmanian devil. This caused problems sometimes, especially during weekends spent in the south in their home village of Solwani. Having the wilderness nearby with its climbable fig trees, abandoned forts, hidden wells, renegade beehives, scorpions and snakes raised the risk of Ghassan's antics. However, he did not need to leave the house and put himself at risk. He can do wild all by himself. Take, for example, the watermelon incident. One day, Ghassan was sitting playing checkers with his youngest daughter, Huda, who was 7 at the time. They were in the courtyard of Ghassan's ancestral village home and were using the backside of the backgammon box to play. Saad brought out a tray of watermelon slices. It was a June afternoon of bearable dry heat, so they sat in the cool shade of an old lemon tree that arced over them, laden with lemons. Ghassan looked up and saw Huda nibbling along the top of this red semicircle of a slice that dwarfed her face. "Is this how you eat a watermelon?" he asked. She looked at him, puzzled, and waited for clarification. "Is this how you eat a watermelon?" he repeated. She started to worry as he was not using his usual terms of endearment. Then he added, "Do you eat it like this?" and imitated her nibbling. Huda looked back at her mother for help and caught her stifling a laugh. "Do you eat a big slice of watermelon like a bird, like this?" He pecked at his slice with his nose, pinkies raised. Huda broke out in a smile that prompted Ghassan to explain, "You eat it like this, like a goat." And Ghassan went into typewriter mode, chomping wildly at the slice from one end to another, watermelon seeds flying left and right. So Daddy's girl took the tip and ran with it, imitating him, putting her whole face into her slice of watermelon, filling her mouth and nostrils with it, digging in deeper until the rind curved up around her face. She looked up at her father with a long red smile that extended up to her ears, watermelon seeds entangled in her curls. He rewarded her with a pat on the back and a kiss on the top of her head. 2 days later, the family was back in Beirut. They arrived late at night and Saad put the kids to bed. She returned to check on them and noticed that Huda was snoring. She joked about it with Ghassan. "She's even taking on your snore, God help us." A week later, Huda was feverish and was having difficulties breathing at night. They called the family doctor, and he diagnosed her with asthma and prescribed some holistic treatments, including weekends in the mountains. But 2 weeks later, Huda was still laboring with her breath day and night, so they took her back to the doctor. This time, the doctor located the problem with a cursory examination. "There's a seed lodged up her left nostril," he told Ghassan with a smile and a shake of his head. "The damn thing's sprouting." The doctor anticipated Ghassan's accustomed hearty laugh, but Ghassan just stood there with a look of terror on his face. "I can take it out right now without putting her under," the doctor added. Ghassan crouched in front of Huda, pinched her cheek, and said, "It won't hurt, Habibti." The procedure took less than half an hour. The doctor put the extracted seed in a jar and told Ghassan that he should keep it to preserve this memory for her. Years later, when Huda will leave to attend the Lebanese American University, she will take the jar with her.
Thank you so much. I love that part of the story. It's great. So, let's see. I'm choosing which question I want to go from there. So maybe this is a good time to talk about characters, because you build and reveal both of your characters, who are very complex and flawed and sometimes unlikable, but also you draw their portraits with such compassion, even if that portrait is merciless, right, and very revealing. But a lot of the time, the way that I think both have this thing in common where you do this with these scenes that hinge on these really tiny details, like the watermelon seed, or I mean, I could name so many things, scenes with Mizna in which this happens. Yeah. Or these little tells, maybe, that the characters have that reveal things about them that maybe they didn't even know about themselves. And I'm curious. I mean, also like on a selfish level, because I really genuinely want to know, how do you go about making that happen on the page, whether on the level of the scene or the line, and how was that in these particular books to explore these characters?
I think for Mizna, I mean, I would say Mizna's probably one of the more unlikable characters I've written. My father hates her. He has a lot to say about her.
I hate her.
Really? See, I'm going to tell you the same thing I said to him. I'm like, what? But it's funny because I find her very redeemable. But then
love her.
When the book came out, I realized like not a lot of people don't find her redeemable. And I was like, oh, okay. I will say this. It kind of does remind me a little bit of therapy, where I believe that you can effectively help people even if you don't like them. But it's really hard to do therapy, for example, with someone that you're not even curious about. And I think there's something about like finding curiosity about a person, or in this case, a character's motives and like desires and why it is that they behave the way that they do, that injects a certain amount of empathy into the process of therapy or of writing. Like, you know what I mean? It does something, because you can't, it just changes the way you're looking at them. Now you're like, well, how did we get here? As opposed to like, oh, you're a terrible person, why did you do this, etc. And I think with Mizna, there was always, like, I mean, I've said this before, like, I do things that are not in my interest all the time. You know, I do things that are not in the service of the life that I want to be living. Maybe not constantly, I mean, whatever, a fair amount, right?
As we all do.
I'm making terrible choices all the time. Somebody help me. No, but I think, like, I think everyone I know does too. Like, there's nobody I know who's like, just like, oh, every choice I've made has made perfect logical sense, and it's, you know, it doesn't work that way. And so if we take that as sort of like a fact of the human condition for most of us, then you can kind of bring that into characters, and instead of require them to live up to a certain ideal, instead you can kind of let them misbehave, let them go about the wrong things for the right reasons, or the right things for the wrong reasons, and then kind of work backwards from there. Like, I think with Mizna, there was, her big flaw is that she wanted something more than she wanted anything else, you know?
That's right.
And she she wanted it so much that it just consumed her, and it's sort of like somebody longing for one meal, and the meal in front of you, like that metaphor of like the meal in front of you kind of goes like rots, right?
Right.
And that's how she lived her life. And in that, when I think of her in that way, it's like a tragedy, actually. You know, like it's something
True.
she was plagued with and possessed with, this longing for what couldn't be and what wasn't. And that's like a really sad, actually, life and way to live her life. So once I once I figured that out, that piece of it out, then I could have her do all sorts of things that were not great, because I could because again, she was always trying to go after the same thing, but she just was doing it in like these really, myopic and like at times cruel to other people ways, because that was sort of her sickness, you know? And like, so like once you see it, for me, once I can figure out like some sort of curiosity or like interest in working backwards from like why a character or a person would do something, then I'm like hooked. Then it's fine. Like, I don't have to approve of your behavior, you know, to be intrigued by you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
Oh, that's such a great way of putting it.
I should say that I liked Mizna until, of
Did I
course,
convince you?
Zakaria died, yeah,
I
of
know.
course.
Are we doing spoilers?
I mean, and to be fair, Zakaria dies in the first few pages, so yes.
That's true,
Zakaria dies.
actually,
Yeah. I actually did that once, and I heard someone audibly and I was like, it's really fine. It saved you 8 pages of reading. I think so too. I think because then she makes the choices of like marrying who she. I mean, again, she does it. But I think she's also like a victim. Okay, this isn't about Mizna. I'm just like her lawyer forever. I'm like, come on.
No, there's, for example, Ghassan. The other day, Elliot Kola, who was published by Radix too, was interviewing me, and he says, why do these women like put up with Ghassan? He's like, what do they like about him? And I said, I have no idea. And he said, what? You didn't expect that answer. Yeah. And of course, I tried to find something redeemable about Ghassan and what they found, and I do mention that. But the reality is that there's a lot of couples that I'm mystified by, like, why the hell does she put up with him?
Yeah.
It's fair.
Why is he like, so this is in real life. So I was trying to portray one of those couples, like that if you see them together and the way they interact or the way they interact with other people, say, why the hell does she live with him? So that's one of the characters that's not likable.
I liked him.
You like Ghassan?
But that just says something probably about me that we can unpack later on. I think it's because, to your point, it's the little moment. Like, I think the way he is with his daughter and the tenderness he shows in that, and even the humor when he's like trying to pay the guard off, and he's like, "This is for your short memory," or whatever. "This is for you to forget."
And it doesn't work.
There's a playful. There's like I don't know. There's a way that he. There's something about him that was charming. Maybe this is just a Hala thing, so maybe.
I think there's a second character that's not really likable.
The first story, right? Like she's
Sharifi, of course.
She's like, yeah.
I mean, she's likable, but she's very intense.
Yeah.
She's like a huge personality condensed into one very potent person.
Yes.
Yeah, how could I forget?
Yeah.
She's not. There's nobody will put up with her, right? Her own family, the soldiers,
all of Hezbollah.
Everybody, Hezbollah.
I will never forget that moment.
She even stumps them. And she's. But in the end, you're like, she's somebody that I hope that when the story ends, that it's kind of a character that you love to hate or hate to love. I don't know what it is, but there's that something is redeemable at the end, and you can feel an affection for her. Yeah.
Actually, I'm wondering if you're willing to talk about it, speaking of characters, that there's one story, for folks that haven't gotten a chance to read it yet, where the character has your name. Would you like to talk about that?
Of course, Send My Regards to Your Mother was published by MERIP, Middle East Report, and it was an issue that was focusing on the prison system in the Arab world. And I was telling Zeyn, there's a cosmic coincidence where the American Bar Association sent me a job. Basically, I was translating, said, can you translate these court documents from trials in Bahrain of political prisoners? Because the Bahraini government was lying about them. So I had been, when I was in college, I landed in prison as a political prisoner in Bahrain, and almost died in that prison. Was killed in the prison. But the reality is that I wasn't even political at the time. It actually, and it's something that politicized me. But as I'm doing the translation, I was telling Zeyn that I got one of those email notices that zipped in front of me, and I stopped it, and it was from the editors of Marip, and they said, 10 years ago you were at a party and you were telling the story about your imprisonment in Bahrain. And we've never had a literary story in there, and all the stories in this issue are going to be like, nonfiction. But we wanted to do the way you told the story. We want you to do a literary piece that way. So it's largely based on my imprisonment. I mean, all the events had actually happened.
Wow.
There's very little that didn't happen there, and that's.
What was it like to write it in that form?
Henry back there, my guardian angel, will tell you that he was my student, and when I would tell that story, and you've been through this, I'm sure both of you, where you tell a story and they say you should write it, and so and sometimes you know that you should write it at some point, but you haven't got that hook. You don't know, like, and sometimes people don't understand why it's a good story, but why, why? But like, how am I going to differentiate it from other prison stories? So one day I'm sitting there in a writing workshop, and somebody, and we're doing, I was running the workshop in the Writers' House at the University of Maryland, and somebody wrote a poem about somebody being in prison, and I had this throwaway line like, when I was in prison, this happened, and then, and there's this, Jenna, are you here? No, she's not here? Okay. She was coming back, she was coming from Rutgers to see this, but Jenna was like the mother hen of the workshop. There's like, how it is in a workshop, there's somebody that like, and she's like, excuse me, what did you just say about being in prison? And I said, yeah, I was in prison, etc., but we can talk about it later. We need to finish workshopping. So she turns to the class and she says, is anybody interested in workshopping at this moment? Don't you think it's the most important thing at this moment is for Zeyn to tell us his prison story so we can get experience? And everybody says, yep, everybody agrees. So I told it. And when I was leaving, Henry, was talking to me, and Henry and I have read each other's works, every word, and he's like telling me, there's something funny about that story, as tragic as it is. And there is, you'll find there's things like the Ocean Pacific short, the fact that I was in prison with Ocean Pacific shorts, carrying them.
So that's a true detail. That's
that's
life.
A true detail.
Okay.
Yeah. He says, and things like the fact. By the way, when I went into prison, just like the story, I was wearing a T-shirt that had two cats sitting on a trash can.
That's real?
Stoned. Stoned. And it said, that's right, we bad.
You can't make up these kind of details.
I'm walking around in prison with this, that's right, we bad.
Oh my God.
You can't make up this shit.
No, you can't.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so...
This is epic, by the way.
That's amazing.
Wow, okay. I don't know how to follow that up. Oh, goodness. Okay, well, let's see. I have...
Oh, that's true.
That's a really good idea.
I have it in a plastic bag, sealed.
Oh. Okay,
Auction, yeah. Auction time.
Oh, goodness. I have to get this back on track, but I don't want to. I have more questions than we're going to have time for, but let's see. Let's do this one. So I think that both of your books, talk in various points about the difference between being Arab in America and being Arab in Lebanon or in Syria or in various other places. And not just in terms of race or ethnicity, but in terms of class as well. Also, some of the characters even struggle with sort of their own internalized racism, their own internalized Orientalism. And I'm wondering, if you would both be willing to talk about how your characters deal with that, as well as how you went about writing about that, or how it was to write about that.
I think there's like no with Lebanon in particular, right? So like a lot of both books have had, both of my novels have like had a fair amount that took place in Beirut, and I think it's really hard to write authentically about that place without writing about like the accompanying things. Like I mean, you can't like so you could like it would not be. I'm thinking particularly about like domestic labor and like how I would not have been able, like you would not be an authentic story without speaking to that, right? Or without like writing that into the stories or into the houses or into the whatnot. And I remember there was like in Salt Houses, there was a chapter where during the war, there's a domestic worker who basically is left behind, and she can't get her passport, she can't whatever. And I had that's funny because in the entire book, that section was the only one that like I've had Arab readers be like, what was the like, why did you have to, like you were sort of talking about our struggle, you know what I mean? And like that takes it away, but it's like it wouldn't be authentic not to, you know, like you have to talk about the ways that you oppress as well as the ways that you are oppressed.
Right.
Like you don't get to pick and choose. And so I think that in some ways like authenticity necessitates writing that into the characters, because I wouldn't be like, there is a hierarchy in places like Lebanon, and I'm like you're saying, there's a hierarchy I think anywhere in the Arab world, because we're no longer thinking of like, oh, I'm an Arab and so that's the identity marker I have to hold on to, right? Like that's the thing about positionality with identity, right? So here I'm very aware of myself as Arab. Right. I'm less aware of myself as that if I'm in an Arab majority country. There I'm going to be maybe more aware of myself as being a holder of an American citizenship or of what my socioeconomic status is or whatnot. And so you by necessity have to start thinking about those things. And so places like Lebanon, writing the characters that I write, who are often like mixed lineage, part Palestinian, part Syrian, like there are these hierarchies within within the society. And so like you wouldn't, I think it's just like to tell it properly or to tell it authentically necessitates like having the characters grapple with that, or else you would kind of be writing these weirdly sterile characters that don't seem to be actually living in that place.
Yeah.
You know?
Right. I come from a background that made me very class conscious because I come from South Lebanon. And when I was, for example, in boarding school, I was very aware of like my class, and and people used derogatory terms to talk about us, like the word mitwalli, which is a derogatory term, they basically, but I changed classes, like you change, when you migrate to the US, you kind of in a different class then. When you return, you're suddenly a different, you're the American or whatever. So we have the privilege of experiencing life at all levels, basically. And also there's another aspect in terms of the stories in here that my experience, I have lived in Saudi Arabia, and one of the stories, the groom, which is about this couple that discover an abused monkey, and through the exchange, the interaction with the monkey, they realize that they're both traumatized too. They've had both trauma. But in Saudi Arabia, it was a different issue. It didn't matter as a Lebanese what class you were. That suddenly you were trumped, sort of like it was like something. There was a hierarchy how the Saudis saw us, right? We were lower class. There was like the Europeans, the Americans were the top-notch, British, et cetera, and then there was like a hierarchy for them in terms of the Arab nationals. And then there was a hierarchy in terms of the domestic workers, the Ethiopians, the Filipinos, the Thais, et cetera. So it became much more complex, and you never felt, no matter what, my experience, and you never felt that in Saudi Arabia, as a Lebanese, that you were even middle class. You were treated like you were there to serve them, and so that's even a whole other nuance there in terms of class.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you both for these answers. I mean, it's very complicated even throughout these stories in this novel. I think that we are coming up on time for audience questions.
Great.
Even though I do have many more, sorry, touch the mic. Even though I have many more questions that I would love to ask, but I will cede control so that other folks can ask questions. Thank you both so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zeyn.
Yeah, thank you, Zeyn.
So please don't be shy. Would anyone like to ask a question?
You can just raise your hand and we'll come with a microphone to you.
Hi. Hey, first, I'm so proud of you, so happy for this book. It's so exciting. I'm really excited to read it. I know Ustaz Amin in the context of him teaching me Arabic, so I wanted to know a little bit more about your process with writing in Arabic and your relationship with writing in Arabic specifically, because of course you're a native. So I was wondering, that relationship can sometimes be difficult because abuse, especially, for example, in like a prison in Bahrain, happens in Arabic.
Exactly.
So I wanted to know if you would write in Arabic, how do you write in Arabic, in what context, and if you're ever going to write a book in Arabic.
Right, great question. That's my student Malak, by the way.
All right, Malak.
I rigged the whole thing. Especially when you're writing when I was writing the story about Sharifi, which is based on my aunt Sharifi actually, and a lot of times when I was writing dialogue, especially, I felt I had to write it in Arabic to get the tone right, to get the. Yeah, I'm sure you've done that
I
too.
was more saying I felt that when I was reading it. It was
Yeah.
so lovely because
Yeah.
even though it was in English, I could like hear it said in Arabic.
Right.
So it like makes sense that you did that.
And my student Aya, when she read that story,
Aya.
see, it's all stacked. When she read that story, she told me like, I want this to be in Arabic. I want to hear it in Arabic because and then I explained to her that I actually wrote a lot of the dialogue in Arabic.
Oh, I love that.
Every time to get her cadence, to get it, and the way I remembered it, right? So that's the the Sharifi story is the best example of how, and I've done that with poetry too. When it's like I wrote a poem that about all of my aunts, and I was writing it in English and I was having a hard time, and so I wrote it in Arabic, and then I translated it, and it worked much better.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. No.
That's such a good question.
I haven't read your books yet. I'm from Germany, like Arabic German, but I will for sure read them. So my question now is, you talked about this intergenerational struggles, and my question now is regarding the future. So the first generation, second generation was still like struggling a lot with the origin, like the places they came from, Middle East, Lebanon, Syria, and our generation and the next one don't have this big connection anymore or strong. So my question is now, what do you think will be the biggest struggle in the future for this generation, and what will be the most beautiful thing that we're going to take from it? Thanks a lot.
Wow.
Beautiful question. I don't know. I mean, I think like I have spit up on my shirt. That's so gross. It's not my spit up.
It happens.
I don't know. I think that that might be the first time anyone's asked me a question where I really don't have an answer to it. Right? Because I can always like talk. I mean, my issue is not like talking. It's talking less. I think that there's something to be said for this is what I'll say. I think that even if the individual, to go back to like the idea of being multi-generational or like intergenerational traumas or like the things we inherit intergenerationally, even if you, not you, but like a person as an individual is not feeling sort of like torn between different places or questioning identity, or they feel more firmly from a place, I think that they've still probably grown up watching people in their life. So whether it's their parents or it's their grandparents, like there's still, I think it takes several, maybe the question you're asking is like 5 generations in, what happens? In which case I'd say, I think they probably just struggle with whatever people struggle with when they're not preoccupied with these larger, these other issues. But I think there's something about like, even if a person is not themselves feeling pulled into a place or pulled away from a place, like I think there's something about growing up watching somebody long for something, growing up watching a caretaker long for something, or a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or whatever. I think that leaves an imprint on you in some way, and depending on what they do or how they cope with that, like I think that's where you sort of, that gives you a blueprint of what you then do with like loss when you encounter it.
I don't know if this answers your question, but I feel like what I've experienced is that like this generation that came here is obviously there's the same kind of divide that I see happening in terms of even among Americans who have been living. There's a generational divide in terms, especially when it comes to ideas about racism. Like, so for example, I was taking a group of Palestinian kids to a solidarity rally in Columbia Heights, and the parents were calling them, trying to get them back because my neighborhood was predominantly black, and they were afraid of crime and all that. And they're like, you could see the kids rolling their eyes at their
Right.
parents. So there's different ideas. I feel like there's an evolution. In general, this generation has taken an evolutionary step when it comes to racism, when it comes to sexuality, and when it comes to all these things. Like there is an evolutionary, and that applies to whether you're an immigrant or you're a native or of any color. Yeah.
I guess, the ideal would be that if you no longer are plagued by those issues, what you then what can take that space is figuring out how to be an ally. You know what I mean? Like figuring out how to help people that are, like, maybe that's one of the things that can happen.
That's a very good question.
We have time for one more from our live audience and one from our virtual audience.
Hi.
Hi.
I was a student of Zeyn's 7 years ago.
I mean, what is this?
You stacked the audience here.
I really saw this yesterday, and I was like, I have to be there. Well, I got sent from a friend who's also a student. Anyway, so thank you so much, both of you, for speaking on your accomplishment, I would like to say. What I found really intriguing about what you both said is there's like a huge contrast with how you approach your character development, and how like you really talk about, I think you pull from like your psychology background, and you talk about how you have to look in deep into the trauma of that person. What is their core identity, and why are they doing the things that they're doing? Whereas Zeyn, it feels much more like observational. It's like, it's kind of like, yeah, this guard is going to bribe somebody because we see it all the time. And innately, like intrinsically, this father is going to be super caring towards his daughter, and you're going to see that human aspect of him. So you have these two different perspectives on how you approach characters. And I was just kind of wondering, when you're writing, what do you think the purpose is? Like, are you doing this because, wow, I'm observing something and I feel like it needs to be written and it's kind of funny and it turns into this story? Or are you thinking at the end, like, my audience, what are they taking away from it? Like, what is your main purpose when you're writing?
Oh,
Great
what a question.
I would say I mean, the honest answer is I write because I don't feel well in the world if I don't. Like I don't feel like myself. I don't feel engaged. I don't feel connected to people if I'm not doing it. So there's a very, one could call it selfish, one could call it self-care, whatever. But like there's definitely like it feels very, to your word, intrinsically motivated. Like it's something that I would, if someone today came up to me and said, you are canceled forever and you're banned from ever writing a book, or rather you're banned from ever publishing again, I would continue to write. Like I don't have any doubt about that. Maybe for a while I'd be a little shaken and like it might take me a bit to get back on that horse, but like I would be for certain back at writing at some point. So I think there's something about it being a way that I survive. Like I kind of need it as a form of survival. Now, it would be dishonest to say that I think once you start to publish, I'll speak for myself, because I was trying to implicate all of us in this. Ow, God damn it. Oh, no. Once you just like vomit on me, like hurting my, once you start to publish, for me, once I started to publish, it did introduce the concept of audience for me in a way that had not been there before. So I now have like, I'm working on this new book and it's like, I have an editor because I sold it on a partial and I have to touch base with that person and I have to think about whether I'm meeting the conditions of the contract and I have to think about what is the agent going to want to try to sell this first or that first and what should I do with the short story. Like there's things that I'm thinking about that I was not thinking about before I published. They're not necessarily, again, they can be lovely issues to have, but there is something to be said for like if you let that noise be too loud, it does get in the way of like the actual like process. So there's something that I'm navigating now that I wasn't before, but I'm also like that's such a, it's such a privileged problem to have, right? Like,
and I agree with you. Like I think it is, it helps me survive writing. It is a survival thing. It is therapeutic, obviously, and I would write no matter what. I've written to the ether for years now.
Experience.
So I'm no stranger to that. But the one thing that is that also there's a political undercurrent to what I write. That's what drives the work. But they don't have to. I don't need the reader to get that. It's just what gets me going and gets the narrative going. So, for example, the ghost story, Killdeer, basically is all about the inheritance of ghosts that didn't belong to us as Arabs. We were we kind of inherited them. Yeah, I mean, that's a great example where I didn't care. If somebody read that as a ghost story and thought it was a good ghost story, I'm fine with that. You don't need to understand that this is about the inheritance of ghosts or anything political, but it's the hook that gets me going, and yeah.
I love that you brought that up because I had a question I didn't get to ask about the haunting of the self, and it was perfect. So yeah, thank you for touching on that too.
Excellent.
Our final question from Sarah Gonzalez is, how do both of your professions outside of writing, civil engineer and clinical psychologist, play a role in your work?
I think for me, I mean, I spoke about it a little bit. I think for me, they feel, I always say this, like they feel like very complementary fields. Like they both work with storytelling, they both work with narrative, they both use that as a currency. They both involve taking fragments and things that feel like they might be disconnected or you don't know where this fits into that. And you are in part, not responsible, but part of what you do in both of them is you try to either do it yourself on the page or help somebody do it, create like a narrative and create a coherent whole out of these different like fragments. I do think that training to be a psychologist helped. Like I think the better I become at one, the better I become at the other. And I think the better, like the more that I learned how to be a decent psychologist, like that involves knowing how to ask questions about like intention and desire and motivation. And again, why do people do things that seem counterintuitive or whatnot? So then if you can take those questions and those inquiries and apply them to characters, and I think that helps you create more complex characters. And somebody recently asked me the revert, which I thought was interesting. It's like, how has writing helped your psych practice?
Oh,
which I know nobody had ever asked. I was like, wow. And I don't remember. I had such a good answer. If only I could remember what it was. It was. I think it was something about how. I remember what it was. I think it was something about how writing. There's something about writing that involves showing up every day and showing up with as much of yourself every day, and that the more you are showing up for the task authentically, the more it yields like some sort of fruits of your labor. See, it was a good answer. I heard like a murmur in the audience. And then like if you do that with the that certainly has translated into, because the first couple of years you're a therapist, you're so stiff, you're like imitating a white person you saw on TV playing a therapist. Like, tell me how that feels. and then at some point you're just like showing up and you're just like more of yourself, and because you realize that that's what people respond to, authenticity.
Right. In terms of being a civil engineer, I did that for 20 years. I had a successful career, but I was forced into it by my father. It's a.
I know your father. I like how you said I like your father.
Exactly. I was forced into it, and not only was I forced into it, I was forced into being to studying civil engineering in Saudi Arabia, which was like a prison term.
Oh God.
Probably worse than the Bahrain experience. And so even after all of that, when I came to the United States, they didn't accept my degree. And so I literally was like in the trenches with the American working class and learned a lot about class politics and racism, especially working with black workers that were calling me brother. And I don't know why they weren't referring to other people as brother, So I learned a lot from that experience, these characters, and also I learned how to write like a racist Southern man, because some of the foremen that I knew, like the character I was writing, was based on a foreman that I knew, and so then I found out that they're actually lying. They told me that we don't accept your degree, but they were charging the client as if I'm an engineer.
Wow.
And then I got a job as a civil engineer.
Oh my
so
God.
then I was experiencing life, but for 2 years I was like literally working physical labor, in construction. Wow. And then I made it. And then I met a whole bunch of new characters, which are civil engineers, and I'm sad to say that civil engineers think that the human condition can operate in a formula, and if the formula doesn't work, you're to blame, not, pull yourself up by bootstraps and all that bullshit. And civil engineers were like the most soulless people I've ever met. I'm sorry to say. And so I had to, at one point I was like sitting with my boss, and we were renovating fraternity houses at the University of Maryland, and he's explaining to me that I picked the wrong gloss and paint color for the fraternity bathroom on the ground floor. And that's when I had an existential moment. I was like, well, what is he trying to match it with? Vomit? Because that's what's going to be on it the first day. So I decided I looked at him, and he's like, oh my God, this guy's been there for 30 years. He graduated from it, and he thinks this is the world, right? I got to get out of this racket, and that's when I went and took a bunch of poems and stories and gave them to the head of the English department at the University of Maryland, and said, I want to switch careers. Do you think I'm crazy? And within 24 hours, he called me and he says, no, I think you have potential, and I'll accept you in English. Oh in a very competitive
That's an amazing story. Had you always wanted to write? Like this whole time you were writing?
Oh, I was like, I see. Dad, the same guy who forced me to
same
this,
one.
will tell you that we didn't know what you look like because since age 5 I was, my face was in a book. And I was right, and I was already getting, while I was an engineer, I was having a poem here and a
I
poem
see,
there
I
and a
see.
short
So you were doing
story
it throughout.
published.
That's
Yeah,
beautiful.
yeah.
That's so beautiful, Zeyn.
Well, and we're so grateful that now
Yeah.
we have these books.
Exactly.
So thank
Yeah.
you so much, both of you.
Yeah.
And Zeyn is all the way from here from
Zeyn!
Italy.
Thank you all so much for joining
Thank you so
us.
much for
I think that's
coming.
it.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was so fun. I know you're dying to read all of their books right now, so go ahead and out to the bookstore and buy them, and then just come back in here and we'll all hang out for a little bit. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I was like trying not to, smack it.